record on this computer. So hi everyone, I'm Amanda Barr with FrontierSpace, and we were really happy to be able to show Aubrey Pongluelert, close enough? Pongluelert, her show, Tending the Tapestry. Did I get that right too? Tending to the Tapestry? Tending to the Tapestry. I should have put that, written that down in front of me. Knew I was gonna be biff it right before I started talking. So, Aubrey Pongluelert, Tending to the Tapestry, which you made as part of your master's thesis in environmental sciences. And so you interviewed 10 different women who work in Montana in environment, in the environment in some shape or form, and then created tapestries based on their experiences and stories, right?
Correct.
And now you're going to tell us about that and what it was like getting kind of shut down during COVID and not getting to show your work with your thesis like you had planned. But thankfully we were able to give you some space to do that.
Yes.
And you were actually the last show in our alley space.
That's right. Yeah, I feel so lucky.
And I mean, it was beautiful show to do a send-off with, because it was so Montana focused and with the earth. And that tapestry where you wove the gallery together into the center. Yeah. Felt like that was really poignant to kind of conclude FrontierSpace's time in that alley, and kind of it's kind of a metaphor, weaving our time there together as we, take a little pause and then move forward in our next iteration. Thought that was a really beautiful show. We'll say thank you for tying those ends up for us there.
That's fun. Love that.
So I'm gonna stop talking now and let you run it.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. Before I begin, I want to do a land recognition, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I and those of us in Missoula, Montana, are here in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. And I ask that those of you joining me from elsewhere also take a moment to recognize the Native history of the land that you are living on. Thank you. I also want to extend a huge thanks to Amanda for facilitating this show. It was such a lovely way to kind of wrap this whole project up. It's been a long time, and FrontierSpace was such a intimate and just a wonderfully local space to share this work, and I feel very grateful for that. I don't know that any of the participants and the storytellers of this project are here tonight, but I also want to thank them. They are the heart and soul of this project, and I have been so inspired, and this project is really theirs. I also want to thank always my parents and the advisors who helped make this happen. So just a quick outline, I'm going to give a project intro, and that's going to include some information about the written component of my thesis, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about my qualitative research methods and how I integrated and kind of merged that with my artistic processes. And then I'm going to do a reading, the afterword of my thesis, and then we'll have a little Q&A if there's time for that. So this project really began when I was an undergraduate, and I was studying studio art and environmental studies, and I started working in the organic farm at the college, and I had this crazy realization that, or it felt crazy in the moment, that the feeling that I experienced when I was growing food was exactly the same feeling that I experienced when I was in my studio making art. And I didn't really know what to do with that. I was just like, whoa, this is wild, and I don't really know what it means. And I didn't pursue that feeling that much. But when I came to Montana and I started working in sustainable ag, studying sustainable ag, getting back kind of in the dirt, really, I felt this lack in my kind of artistic expression. And so I started taking art classes, undergraduate art classes, to feel that again. And that feeling, that connection just came up. And this time I couldn't ignore it. And I recognized it as that magic of witnessing something come into being under your own hands, and that manifestation of soul and emotion as this creative and emotional language. And I decided that I wanted to do a project about it. So this project kind of came into being when I was introduced to the concept of ecofeminism. And that theory, ecofeminist theory, came to serve as the framework for this project. And I'm just going to give you a brief, like really short description of what ecofeminist theory is. It's basically a recognition, understanding that the exploitation of women, environmental degradation, and numerous social injustices are all issues of oppression rooted in a hierarchical logic of domination that can be traced back to the construction of the dominant human, typically white male. And learning this theory, it was just like this, something clicked. And I was like, oh, everything that I'm doing in art and in ag makes sense with this, because historically speaking, women have been the traditional primary food producers and creative makers, and also have historically been marginalized and not recognized necessarily for that work. And so I wanted to bring those three things together, and that's how this project came to be. And so throughout this process of exploring these concepts, I came to see this image, and it was this image of a web or a tapestry or a fabric. And that image, that tapestry of life, has become the major motif, the guiding image throughout this work, both in the written components and in the visual components. And so overall, this project works towards an intersectional ecofeminism, which recognizes that objects of oppression are not intrinsically connected, but stand in solidarity with each other. And it considers the diversity of women's experiences across race, class, and national boundaries. It also recognizes and emphasizes the value of non-academic knowledge sharing, which is something I've grappled a lot with, how a lot of the knowledge that is circulated throughout academic spheres is not shared in languages or in means that are accessible to people who hold rural or indigenous knowledge, and how valuable that knowledge is. And I think that art is a means of bridging that divide. So the project purpose was really to explore the experiences of women farmer artists, because I wanted to find out if other people felt the same way that I did, which might seem a bit self-indulgent, but I came to learn that so many people did, and it was validating, and it was so beautiful. And then I used those connections to fill the literature gap between art, ag, and ecofeminism. And I also work to use those connections to expand languages used in environmental and intersectional ecofeminist discourse, and to make space and kind of give more value to creative and emotional languages in academia. This project also, fundamentally, it's a storytelling project. And so a primary goal is to share the stories and amplify the voices of women who are farmers and artists. So throughout this process, what I found was that the creative languages that are expressed through art and farming serve as tools in healing and confronting myriad issues across personal, public, and social ecological spheres. And while it was really difficult to separate all the stories and identify all these different themes, because so many of the sentiments shared were so tightly intertwined, I did come up with 3 major themes, which include empowerment through storytelling and engaged communication, sense of place and identity as practices of healing, and confronting social dynamics and deconstructing dualisms. And so the pieces all fit into one of those 3 categories, but as you can see on the website, they kind of come together in this mass that I realized I couldn't untangle. And not only could I not untangle it, that tangling was what this project was about. And that tangling is what I wanted to celebrate. And so this work kind of responds to the ideologies of ecofeminist theory, which seek to reweave new stories that acknowledge and value the biological and cultural diversity that sustains all life. And so, like our human community, like our earth community, and our cosmic community, this project in itself is a tapestry. So the way I went about this was I found women who were both self-identified women who were both farmers and artists, and I conducted in-depth, unstructured interviews. So I basically presented the project and I said, tell me your story however you want to tell it. And that kind of follows feminist qualitative research methods, which recognize the subjectivity and inevitable influence of our own perspectives in any given study. And it seeks to create a space in which research participants are given maximum agency and control in how they tell their story. So really what it does is it refuses the idea that objective research is possible. Anytime we come into any situation, we're going to bring our background, we're going to bring our preconceptions, and feminist qualitative research says, I know that that's happening, and because of that, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share what you would like to share. And I'm not going to bring my own voice into that necessarily. And this is really to reduce the gap between the research and participant and create a more organic, natural conversation in which the participant does have more agency than the researcher. And for me, I also recognize myself as a participant, as a farmer and artist. And so you can't really see it in the photos, but I felt that my presence was really in these pieces on the backs of the fabrics, where they're really messy, and there's things kind of like dangling everywhere, and that to me felt like my own hand and my own story. And in the written component, I actually have my own personal narratives kind of interwoven throughout the thesis, the essay, and that's not something that is shared here, but it's there. So what I did was I interviewed these women. I interviewed 10 women, and then I took their interviews, I recorded them all, and then I transcribed them. And then I used qualitative research methods to then analyze those transcriptions. So I coded them, and then I found major themes and sub-themes. And so that's all very much in like kind of the academic qualitative research sphere. But then what I did is I took those themes and then I translated them into a visual language. And I kept in mind that my motif for this whole project was the tapestry of life. And so I wanted to use mediums and techniques that spoke to that imagery of the tapestry. And so as I talk about my artistic process, you'll kind of see how I worked that in, which was a very fun thing for me to do. So I began with sketches of every woman's story, and these sketches were based on the visual translations of the major themes. And so I kind of began with a broad visual language that was represented by like illustration style, medium, and color palette. So if you go online and look at the show, and I'll do a little screen share at some point here, but I have a pretty earthy, kind of natural color palette, which is what I had in mind the whole time. And then the imagery kind of evolved and developed as I was sketching, and kind of came together as I think you could view all 10 pieces as one piece essentially. And so they all kind of come together with the illustration style and the mediums used. And then I developed specific imagery that were based on sub-themes and unique elements of individual stories. And so, you know, those were things like, I don't know, like a fence or a bug or something like that. And those were all kind of emerged from the vignettes in that I drew from the interviews. And so I went through the same general process for each piece. So I began with this sketch. And then what I did is I used a monotype printing technique called indirect drawing. And I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share, and so you can kind of see the different elements here. Let's see, share screen, desktop 1. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see this, I hope. So the figure of each woman is done with this technique that's called indirect drawing. So basically what I did was I inked up this big block with block printing ink, and then I laid the fabric down on top of that block, and then with a pencil or a pen or a knife or whatever I had on hand, I drew the image of the figure and shaded it with my fingers. And so then when I pulled up the fabric, I had this relief drawing where I had applied pressure, picked up that ink. And so you'll see, you know, how there are kind of some messy bits where the ink also kind of came up, which was actually a really kind of lovely result that I didn't have a lot of control of, and I really liked that. And I think that this technique really worked for the women's bodies because it is more gestural, it is more kind of abstracted, and so with this technique, I wasn't focused on distinct facial features or body features. It was kind of this universal form, and those abstracted lines helped me do that. And so then I used poses or actions that were identified or emphasized in each woman's story. And again, not focusing on what they looked like or, you know, how someone might categorize a female body, you know, trying not to play into those stereotypes too much. I also didn't know what a lot of these women looked like. So most of my interviews were phone interviews. And so that was a big reason why it kind of led me to this method. It's because I didn't know what these women looked like. So I just kind of had to go with this universal form, which ended up working really well, I think, for me. So then what I did is I used a combination of relief block printing and mixed media materials to build up each narrative with more detailed and specific imagery. I'm going to find a better example of that. Let's see. All right, this is a good one. So relief block printing is when you take like wood or linoleum, there's a bunch of materials you can use, and you carve out the image, and then you ink that block up, and then you press it down on your surface, and then you pull it up, and then you get what you left uncarved on that surface. And so I did that with a number of the pieces, and those block prints were carved to add specific imagery to those stories. And then some of the pieces use mixed media materials, outside materials, like in this case, I used garlic, and I kind of sewed the garlic skins onto the fabric. And this was, in this particular piece, it represented a vignette that really spoke to this woman's story and the connection that she felt between art and farming, which was found through really, really like close observation with the things that she was growing, and garlic was one of those things. And she actually found this bug that was eating her garlic because she spent day after day drawing each stage of the garlic. And so in that art process, she learned something about her growing process, which she might not have found otherwise. And that, I think, to me, really embodied her old story. And so the garlic made it into the piece. I'm going to give you an example of a piece that has some block printing in it, so you can see what that looks like. Let's see. So in this piece, the railroad is carved out, and so I carved those lines out and then printed them onto the fabric itself. And then I think, you know, with this idea of intersectional ecofeminism, which really emphasizes and honors women's unique and personal experiences, this step in my artistic process spoke to that, in that though these pieces come together as one, each one does have a distinct elements to it. And that's what I was trying to do with the block printing and with the introduction of outside materials. The last step that I used, last process that I used was sewing and embroidery. And let's see, I'll give you, here's some embroidery. And so I used kind of two languages here. One was the language of embroidery, and then one was the language of sewing. And for me, the embroidery really felt like an embellishment technique, and I used embroidery mostly with like greens and like reds and earthy tones. And those lines, the lines that the embroidery created, were used to depict natural and creative growth, which were major themes present in nearly every story. So almost every single piece has this embroidery, this embellishment in it, and it kind of brings all the pieces together in that language. I also used sewing techniques, specifically mending techniques. And these mending techniques were really trying to speak to this idea that in our society right now, in our human community right now, we've been doing a lot of damage to our own community, to the earth community, and following that imagery of the tapestry of life, I kind of imagined those as holes in the tapestry. And so in several pieces, I've cut out fabric to represent those holes. And the work that these women are doing is mending work, it's tending work. And so I used these mending stitches like the whip stitch, overcast stitch, and surgical suturing stitches to represent the healing that these women are doing with their farming and artistic work. And so you'll see those stitches throughout the pieces, some more in some than others. In this piece that we're looking at right now, I have a whip stitch that kind of closes up the edges, and then I have a surgical suturing stitch that is kind of bringing those edges back together. So these mediums, these embroidery and sewing mediums, are the most universal mediums across the series. And kind of going back to that image of the tapestry, the stitching is absolutely a very explicit nod towards the tapestry of life image. And it also serves as kind of giving or showing the significance of art processes that have historically been regarded as women's crafts. Crafts being things that aren't regarded as high arts, that don't get put up in art museums, which are predominantly full of male art even to this day. And so I really wanted to reclaim and celebrate women's traditional rural and folk arts and recognize those as formal forms of art production, and say that deserves a name if that person wants to put a name by their piece. And this kind of work, this craft work, is absolutely valid as an art form. I'm gonna stop my screen share, and you can all go onto the website and look at some of these more detailed images of some of those stitches. What we're looking at right now is one of my favorite stitches. It's called, they're called French knots, and I think that they do a really wonderful job of kind of showing like connectedness and then also separating out into individual stories. I think we come back to me now. So I wanted to read an excerpt from my thesis. It's actually my afterword. And I wrote this in April, actually kind of after I turned in my thesis. And I wrote it because it felt really necessary to connect this project to what was going on with the pandemic. And I felt that this project was quite relevant to what was going on. And I think it's still relevant today. And I think it's what I would like to leave you with. So I'm gonna go ahead and share this with you. Remember, this is from April. Okay. Perched on my desk chair with knees pressed into chest, my hands stretch out over the keyboard like twigs from a stumpy tree. I have been trying to pull all the threads of these stories together, to tie them into bundles or wrap them around my fingers or perhaps braid them and present them to you neatly. I write before a post-it note obscured window looking out into the green glow of a maple's young leaves. The street beyond the maple is quieted, and the parking lot beyond the street is emptied. It is April 2020, and though spring continues its growth unfazed, this season has been marked by uncertainty for the human community. Outside of this project, I have been strategically planning gloved and mass grocery store runs, compiling documents for unemployment applications instead of job applications. And every morning, I pair my coffee with the latest news, desperately ingesting local, national, and global updates on the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic until my stomach aches. Back home in California, my parents sit on the phone with me, sometimes for hours a day, confined to their house under the nearly nationwide shelter-in-place orders. They report, as they often do, on the seasons shifting, the rising of new birdsong and the wafting of bright breezes down the ash tree tunnel of Safford Avenue. Over FaceTime, my mother shows me the lilacs beginning their bloom outside her bedroom window and tells me the air is clearer than the usual thickness that settles stagnant over the San Joaquin Valley. My father shows me his garden, thriving in the same soil I helped him weed and harvest when I was young. Though the land there is dry and dusty and boiling temperatures offer the only resemblance to the tropical environment of my father's Thai homeland, his garden flourishes with the humid greens of sweet basil, chili peppers, bitter eggplants, and lemongrass. In its wild, weedy rows, it is a beautiful antithesis to the eye-glazing homogeneity of the valley's razor-straight crop lines. I think of the farmers and ranchers in the San Joaquin Valley, an epicenter of industrialized agriculture where billboards proclaiming the farm's right to water, sourced from reservoirs over the Sierra Nevadas, line the highways that cut through endless miles of monoculture almond groves and cabbage rows. I think of the thousands of immigrant and migrant farmers still bent over in the fields, going hungry, unable to afford the food they harvest as grocery supplies run short and their workdays grows long. As undocumented laborers, they receive no stimulus checks, have limited access to testing or other healthcare services, and I wonder how many COVID-19 cases amongst them have gone unreported. Across the globe, while some communities are forced into lockdown, others are still being forced from their homes by human violence and the impacts of climate change. While the media floods with messages on social distancing practices and hand sanitizing instructions, chemical toxins still run through our blood and from mother's breast milk into babies' bellies. While we count the numbers of people lost to COVID-19, the non-human inhabitants of this planet also continue to die out at exponential rates. This pandemic is a concentrated reflection of the impacts of our long abusive treatment towards human and earth communities. Bolstered by modern technology's capacity to share mass media coverage and by the devastating impacts on globalized trade and economies worldwide, the violence of COVID-19 has made itself visible in ways that so many historical, social, and ecological violences never were. This is not to undermine or devalue the tragedy COVID-19 has inflicted upon the human community, but rather to recognize that such harm has long existed and will continue to thrive if we uphold a paradigm of conquer and use. Viruses are a natural means of maintaining balance in the Earth community. And while COVID-19 is undoubtedly causing catastrophic and world-changing damage to the human community, it is also stripping bare the social structures and systems of our modern times. It is exposing the violent and unsustainable bones of an oppressive, discriminating, and patriarchal corporate capitalist regime. This is a regime, as we are seeing, that falls apart in the face of nature's power. It is a regime which, in arrogant defiance of and disconnection to the ways of nature, cannot in the long term sustain human life. How much more damage will it take for us to see and accept this? For us to understand the return to what was normal will only bring us back to where we are in this present moment. For us to acknowledge that our normal was in fact never normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. How much more damage will it take for us to see and accept that such normalization has been cutting holes in the fabric that holds us all? The multitude of violences we are experiencing today are not the results of COVID-19 alone. They are the intensifying of terrors already made. We are witnessing the calamitous consequences of a torn tapestry of life. And despite it all, we are still slashing down the forests that give us air to breathe, drilling and draining the ground from which our food grows, and pouring waste into the waters from which we drink. Behind the headlines of American states' closures, international travel restrictions, and global infection trends, the Trump administration is allowing polluters to break US Environmental Protection Agency laws without penalty during the COVID-19 pandemic, lowering fuel economy and emission standards for the automobile industry, rolling back climate change regulations that previously restricted new coal plants, weakening regulations on coal-fired power plants' release of mercury and other toxic metal pollutants, and continuing efforts to expand oil and gas drilling. Louder than ever, the earth is blaring signs of the wounds we have made, and yet we are still not listening. As a species, we are failing ourselves because we have built a system that values profit growth over the emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual health of individuals, the human community, and the earth community. The tears in the tapestry of life are spreading, and without mending, we will fall straight through the holes we have made. This is our reality. I would be lying to say that I do not feel despaired at times. But in these moments, I remember the words of Janice Ray. The assumption is that hope is a prerequisite for action. Without hope, one becomes depressed and then unable to act. I want to stress that I do not act because I have hope. I act whether I have hope or not. It is useless to rely on hope as motivation to do what's necessary and just and right. Why doesn't anybody ever talk about love as motivation to act? I may not have a lot of hope, but I have plenty of love, which gives me fight. We are going to have to fall in love with place again and learn to stay put. These sentiments are poignantly relevant in today's context, as we are forced to stay put in our houses and in our towns throughout the world. And in the face of hopelessness, we see evidence of the fight that is fueled by love for each other and the places we call home. For as we bear witness to the unraveling threads and holes in this fabric, we are also witnessing the incredible strength and importance of both artistic languages in connecting us and sustainable agriculture in supporting us. Across the globe, farmers and artists of all forms are rising to meet the current crisis with resilience and compassion. In some cities, music floods the streets at dusk as residents sing and play together from their private balconies. Sitting behind their sewing machines at home, artists, self-defined or not, piece together homemade masks for civilian use as medical supplies run low. Organic seed companies find themselves back-ordered as more and more households look to start their own backyard gardens for self-reliant food sources. Around my own town of Missoula, Montana, local farmers are partnering with each other to offer a range of products available for purchase through online stores and for pickup at organized locations. Other local farmers have set out donation-based farm stands, making produce and plant starts accessible to low-income individuals, all while avoiding in-person interactions. In many communities, artists have come together in virtual collaboration, creating, selling, and offering the profits made to various organizations supporting COVID-19 relief and humanitarian causes. And every day, my mother selects a poem to read aloud and posts it for all to hear. This is the force of creative and emotional languages, languages which are an intrinsic and beautiful part of being human. These are the languages shared through the stories of the women artist farmers in this project. These women's stories speak to both the challenges we face and the healing power of reconnecting to place, to the land, and the greater Earth community. The storytellers in this project prove that the emotional connections cultivated through creative and sustainable agriculture practices foster the love, humility, and care that inspire the action and change we need to survive. Though the threads of their experiences are uniquely their own, they come together, wound and wandering, knotted and overlapping, to show that creativity and emotion are some of the most potent tools we have in recovering our relationships and reweaving our place in the tapestry of life. So, I abandon my attempts to give you a tidy ending and offer instead this messy and tangled and beautiful web in hopes that you will celebrate your own story, your own intertwining threads, and in celebration, fall in love with the ground through which they are sown. So, that's my little reading to go along with the pieces. And that's all that I have for you. I'd like to open it up to questions. If anyone has questions, maybe we can, you can unmute yourselves, or we can do it in the chat if you'd like. Totally your call if anyone has anything they would like to ask me.
I actually have a question.
Yes, let's hear it.
So we talked earlier about Ann Yancha, and she started making her own dyes kind of near the end of her MFA while she was here. And I've done that before in the past too, when I was still doing a lot more fabric art. Have you done any like natural dye with your fabrics?
I haven't done any natural dye with these pieces. I have done natural dye before, and it's something that I would love to do more of. I would also really love to, you know, spin my own yarn and dye my own yarn and, you know, do all that.
Yeah, I know it's also like super
Future
process heavy. I could see that adding a whole nother layer to this work.
Absolutely.
Like getting even some of the products for the natural dyes from each of the individuals. It's just like kind of like a further on like that could bring so much more into the
absolutely
into really the kind of the texture of each of them. So yeah, I'm sure you thought of things like that, but like it just this work is so like delightful. It just made me so happy, and my mind's just going. I'm like, oh, Anne would love this, and she'd she'd automatically think like, oh, you should be dyeing your fabrics and or yarns.
Something I'd love to experiment with. And I will say that I have plans to continue this project. That's something I didn't talk about, but one of the things that I was interviewing, mostly women in Montana, which means that I was interviewing mostly white women. And something that came up in this project was, especially in the literature I read, was this idea of eco-heritage and eco-stories and digging into our own roots with the land, and recognizing that I personally haven't done a lot of that work. And so the hope is to pursue that work in Thailand and talk to women in Thailand. And I don't know anything about agriculture there like deeply, and so that's something that I would really, really love. It'd be so fun to work with natural dyes and fabrics and things there, and textiles are such a huge thing in Thailand too, and silks and all that could be.
Have you considered applying for a Fulbright or any other kind of grant?
Currently am right now.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good to hear, because that seems like the exact sort of project that you could get a big grant to go over to Thailand and do.
Yeah.
I think you've got another question in the comments.
Yes. Ellie, hi Ellie. Is feminist qualitative research something that can be used in? Oh, here I'll read it out loud. I'm sure everyone can see it. But is feminist qualitative research something that can be used in all contexts? Where has it been used before? Mostly in the ecofeminist sphere? Awesome question. I would say that it is used most in social sciences and the humanities, obviously, and less so in hard sciences, which is kind of something that is a whole nother box to open. But I mean, I was introduced to feminist qualitative research by my advisor, who works in agriculture, but not specifically with ecofeminism. And I personally think that it can and ought to be applied to any qualitative research. And it really, it carries that term feminist, which is a buzzword, and I think comes with a lot of different connotations that can sometimes be unproductive. But I think fundamentally, it's saying like, I recognize that I can't come into a situation without bringing my life and my background, and the things that I've been taught, and my perspectives, which are always going to be influenced by culture and age, gender, all of these things, So I would argue that it can be used in most contexts. And in terms of ecofeminism, I would say most of the ecofeminist research that I read is pretty heavily dependent on feminist qualitative research. Yes, but by no means is like exclusive to that or is like more present there than it is in other social sciences at all. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but that's what I found. Let's see. I really like the idea of using that way to translate research into artwork because it is more intimate and less self-focused. Yeah, and I think that art is always going to be an expression of who we are and what we know. And that's what's so beautiful about it. I think that that's what makes art so important, is that we can create something that is coming from deep inside of us. And because it is shared in such an emotional way, I feel like good art allows other people to connect their own emotions to the story that you're telling. And so I think that in a lot of ways, that is what feminist qualitative research is. It's saying like, here's my story and I'm giving you agency in how you tell that story. And then when I hear it, I recognize that I'm going to hear something that is probably somewhat different than how you are telling me or how you hear it, just because we're different people. And there's a beauty in that difference. And then there's also a beauty in the connection that comes out of that. And so for me, the theory of feminist qualitative research and the practice of art making, they just go hand in hand.
I think, as coming from the art school perspective, I think you're absolutely correct.
Cool. I'm glad you agree. Thank you for your
validation. I vote yes.
Cool. Any other questions? Concerns? Suggestions?
I don't know. This is so phenomenal. Like, I love that you were able to combine these things into a degree.
Me too. It worked out. It worked out. Wasn't working out at the beginning, but it ended up working out.
It's always a struggle in the beginning, right? Oh, you've got another question.
Oh, it's from my mom. As you were listening to the women's stories, did you have ideas, images, visuals of what their piece would look like? 100%. And with some women more than others, so a few of the women that I talked to, I actually had personal relationships with. And so of course that totally influenced the way that I was perceiving their storytelling. But I think as a visual learner, as a visual person, I do a lot of like color recognition with voices. And so a lot of these women had distinct colors to their voices, which came across in their pieces. And also, oftentimes in their themes, I saw images. I mean, there was one woman who started talking and I was like, oh, it's a web. Cool. And then that was actually one of the first pieces I worked on, because that imagery was so clear and easy for me. And some people were really, really hard. But yes, the answer is yes. I did. Yeah. I think one of the things I also struggled with, because I was working in environmental studies this was going towards environmental studies degree, but I was working in art at the same time, was this trying to find a balance between like my artistic desire to abstract everything and then my like environmental studies, just like knowing that the audience that I had there, I had to present things a little bit more literally than I probably would have chosen to personally. And that was something that I really had to work with, where it was like, oh, I can't just show a web, that's so obvious, but then I go to my environmental studies advisor and she's like, well, what else would you do? And I was like, oh, just like 2 lines, one here and one there, and a dot in the middle, you can figure it out. So I think what was harder than seeing it was seeing it and then putting it down in a way that was accessible to the audiences, as many audiences as possible.
I think you nailed that.
Thank you.
like dang it muted me. I'm really impressed with your ability to kind of navigate both worlds so well, because you're very fluent, it seems, in both sets of vocabulary. Like, if I didn't know you were an environmental scientist, I would have just assumed you were another grad student in fine arts.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. That's sweet.
Like, you could easily sit in on a graduate critique class and talk about your work just as well, or
maybe in the future.
Just as well as any of us. Like, you're very literate artistically, but yet, like, there's so much, like, you clearly understand how to make the work presentable in both spheres, without kind of giving up any of your artistry or your science. And that's impressive, because I can't always do that. I kind of sometimes just like, well, I see it, I don't know why everyone else can't.
Yeah. Can be tricky, definitely. Yeah.
Great job. And thank you so much again for like talking and showing with us at FrontierSpace, because this was
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
great.
I feel like this was a really, I needed this kind of closure to the project. I really wanted to have a show, and it was just so hard. So thank you for making that happen for me. I really, really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone who came tonight.
Yeah, thank you everyone who tuned in to listen to this.
And we'll get this up on YouTube so that even more people can tune in.
Awesome. Great. All right.
You can send it out with your Fulbright application and
Ooh, there's an idea.
show them exactly how cool you are and why they should, pay you to go to Thailand.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.